The subject of my talk today is grief, and I think we all appreciate that the pandemic led to any number of crises within medicine. But one of the crises that I think has perhaps flown a little bit under the radar and that deserves a bit more attention is that it instigated a crisis in grief and bereavement. And I'm just going to start, I'm scrolling through slides here, number 2 and so forth, with just a few images that I think have become somewhat commonplace, perhaps, in our experience of the pandemic, but are, in fact, I think, remarkable when you think about grief and bereavement relative to how it occurs, if you will, in ordinary times. So on slide 2, you can see here a patient speaking to a relative behind a plastic barrier in the Philippines. Here on slide 3, a rather striking image of refrigerated trucks that were used for the temporary storage of corpses of individuals who were killed by coronavirus. This is in New York, in Brooklyn. On slide 4, a setup for a live-streamed funeral in Vienna. And then on slide number 5 here, a photo of a socially distanced funeral that took place in New Orleans just about a year ago. Now, I think when we look at all of these images, it's important to sort of synthesize all of these together and notice that they are united, I think, by representing a significant modification, divergence from how grief and bereavement take place in ordinary times. And the purpose of my talk then is to use the pandemic, to use the coronavirus pandemic as a kind of case study for thinking about the social ethics of grief. That is to say, what can we learn about the ethics of grief from looking at the pandemic? And this strikes me as one of those instances where perhaps we can learn something only because this seems like an instance where a good bit went wrong. So, sorry, just one more slide here, number 6. This is actually the most recent one in my set here. These are funeral pyres in New Delhi, India. Some of you may have heard that the crematoria in India are now overrun due to the surge in cases and deaths of individuals there. So, on slide number 7 here, you can see the agenda for the talk. So let me just lay out briefly what I'm going to do. So first, I want to talk about 3 ways that the pandemic disrupted grief and bereavement, 3 places along the chain or along the process of grief where the pandemic intervened to disrupt grief and bereavement. Secondly, I want to do a little bit of ethics or moral philosophy. It won't be much more than a sketch, but I want to talk a little bit about what it might mean to talk about justice with respect to grief. And in particular, I'll highlight the prospect that we have both a right to grieve and a right to be grieved. Then third, I'll pivot back to talking about medicine in particular. I'll talk about the place of medicine within the sort of network of institutions and so forth that I like to call our bereavement infrastructure. And then I'll conclude with a few observations or recommendations concerning grief as a matter of justice. So let me just begin here with a kind of division of the process of grief as a way of kind of getting a handle on all of the phenomena at play here. So I'll talk about grief being disrupted at 3 different points within this process. So the first point is the point that many within the mental health community call anticipatory grief, that is to say, grief that is already underway or taking place prior to a person's death. In the second stage of grief, I'll be focusing on the immediate aftermath of death. And then finally, in the third stage, we'll be turning to disruptions to what we might call formal bereavement, what we think of as mourning. All right. So starting here, I'm on slide number 9 for those of you who are following along here. So let's start with disruptions of grief that occurred prior to death during the stage that people often call anticipatory grief. So one thing to notice is that coronavirus deaths are, by the lights of contemporary dying processes, quite atypical. So I'm sure most of you know that in most parts of the world now, certainly in most of the more affluent parts of the world, the vast majority of people are killed by chronic diseases that kill them relatively slowly over months or even years. So for example, with the case of cancer, the typical or median period of time between the onset of a cancer and the time at which a person succumbs to it is around 1,100 days. Compare that to death due to coronavirus infection, where the typical time from symptom onset to death is between 10 and 17 days. So obviously a much faster process than we are ordinarily accustomed to. Furthermore, the time during which people actually receive care in hospital prior to death due to coronavirus is actually relatively short. A study conducted here in the UK suggested that the period in question is between 2 and 6 days. Slide number 10 now. Another sort of disruption to anticipatory grief that occurred during the pandemic relates to the fact that, generally speaking, overwhelmingly in different surveys, patients and families generally prefer dying in their own homes. But infectious disease, of course, makes that a good bit more difficult. It's not, of course, very safe from an infectious point of view to have persons with an illness like coronavirus in people's dwellings. So infectious disease itself, the fact that this is a highly infectious disease, often mandated that people receive care in hospital and in intensive care. And as a consequence of this, many of them died in hospitals. A study undertaken by Massachusetts General Hospital, found that of the region's COVID deaths over a 2-month period, about 95% of these took place in hospitals, and 40% of those were in the highly medicalized context of the intensive care unit. And of course, in the course of individuals seeking contact, with their dying loved ones, well, in many cases, this was precluded by the fact that visitations were highly limited due to social distancing protocols, to the extent that friends and family could be proximate to the dying patient. They couldn't be very physically proximate, and in many cases, they had to be separated by barriers, or in some cases, by plastic sheeting. So I think when we look at the impact that the pandemic had on this period prior to a person's death, on grief prior to the person's death, I think we see several different results. First of all, that COVID deaths don't conform to what most people have in mind for a good death. That is to say, most people, when they think about death at all, they don't have in mind a fairly rapid decline in a hospital, which was typical, of course, of the trajectory of COVID illness. The COVID deaths are rapid. They are highly clinical. It is to say they took place in very medicalized settings. And the bereaved typically lacked physical proximity to them. Now, I think that what we know from the mental health literature on grief, from the research conducted by psychiatrists and psychologists, is that these are the kinds of factors that are likely to make grief itself more traumatic, because grief itself tends to be more traumatic, more prolonged, more complex, and more difficult if the deaths that prompt the grief are themselves more traumatic. So it seems likely that these events or these facts about how the pandemic disrupted grief prior to a person's death probably had detrimental effects on people's grief. So that's the first, if you will, sort of stage of the grieving process. I'm now on slide number 12. So the second stage is the disruptions of grief that, if you will, materialize in the immediate aftermath of a person's death, in the minutes, hours, days after a person's death. And one thing I think we see repeatedly, or did see repeatedly throughout the pandemic, is that COVID overwhelmed what we might call our bereavement infrastructure, right? And when I use that phrase, bereavement infrastructure, I have in mind all those institutions that are involved in the management of mortality, of human death. And what we saw in many communities were very striking strains of capacity at morgues, hospital morgues in particular, at coroners' offices, at mortuaries and funeral providers, and at the locations at which individuals are interred, cemeteries and crematoria. So just a few sort of illustrations of the phenomena to which I am referring. I'm on page 13 here of the slides. So here's a photo from California. Last year in California, California was overwhelmed by coronavirus in the last 8 months, and earlier in the spring, they were compelled to store bodies in temporary facilities, kept in parking lots, outside of hospitals or outside of coroners' offices. At one point, the Los Angeles County Coroner's Office, which is sort of set up to handle about 400 deaths per day, was attempting to handle 1,800 deaths per day, which is simply well beyond its capacity. We also saw significant strains put, and here I'm on page 14 of the slides, significant strains put on the materials, right, and physical resources needed in order to make grief and bereavement possible. So you see here a photo of a a set of coffins in Birmingham, UK, being stored as part of a temporary morgue. This was, again, a very common occurrence during the pandemic, but was quite unusual, right? This was not something that we saw prior to the pandemic. We also heard from funeral directors that though the pandemic was, in a certain sense, good for their business, it also caused a kind of overwhelming wave, an overwhelming tidal wave of demand for their services. In some cases, you had funeral directors having to turn away large numbers of customers, which in general in that industry is not something that is at all common. And then finally, here I am on slide number 16. I think the events that have been happening in India recently are particularly upsetting or alarming. The crematory and burial grounds in India are simply overwhelmed. So you're beginning to see open air funeral pyres and handling of corpses that is certainly at odds with prevailing Hindu customs and prevailing Muslim norms as well. So I think when we look at all of these considerations about how COVID overwhelmed our bereavement infrastructure, if you will, undermined our ability to manage mortality, we see a number of discernible results. So first, this resulted in delays in funerals and interments and dispositions. Ordinarily, in most parts of the United States and the UK, for example, persons can have access to the bodies of a loved one for internment and so forth, usually within 24 hours. In many cases, those numbers went up 5- or 6-fold. It also led to delayed release of corpses for non-COVID related deaths. So, for instance, in some parts of the world, deaths requiring a coroner inquest were handled at a much slower pace, and so those delays occurred within the context of the pandemic as well. Third, for the bereaved person, this led to delayed access to the corpse itself. I'll come back to the significance or importance of physical access to the corpse later in my talk. And of course, I think some people would say that the pandemic resulted in corpses not being handled in particularly dignified or in culturally prescribed ways. I understand from persons who are practicing Hindus that the images that they are seeing from India are quite upsetting because this seems very much at odds with many of their customs and mores related to bereavement. So what are the likely effects then of these disruptions in grief, disruptions that occurred in grieving as a result of the pandemic? Well, pretty likely, again, based on the psychological evidence that we have about grief, these kinds of disruptions are likely to lead to greater uncertainty, greater sense of stress, and greater trauma among bereaved persons. And then the final stage of grieving that I'd like to focus on and take stock of disruptions is, if you will, formal bereavement. So the pandemic resulted in, for the most part, corpses being unavailable to bereaved communities, to bereaved individuals. And the availability of the corpse is central to many cultures' grief practices. So, for example, in both Judaism and Islam, the custom is that family members will wash the body of the deceased. I have here on slide number 19 a photo of a traditional New Orleans jazz funeral. Those of you who are not aware of a jazz funeral is an event where large numbers of members of the community lie in the streets, hear a band play as they follow the coffin of a deceased member of their community. And thanks to social distancing guidelines, the jazz funeral was ruled out, of course. Page 20 here of our handout. So we had reduced access to the corpse. We had restrictions on viewings and on open caskets. That is to say, in many cases, the public health guidelines in many parts of the world precluded individuals having an open casket if they had died of coronavirus. And then there were significant limits on the attendees at funerals and other death-related events. There were limits in many communities on the number of persons who could attend. There were limits related to social distancing, how close they could be to one another. And in many communities, they were not permitted to sing or to chant. And again, drawing upon what we know about the psychology of grief, the effects of this disruption are likely to be significant and by and large detrimental. It's likely to lead individuals who are in bereavement to feel that the death of the individual is somehow not complete, or that the grief has in some way been short-circuited or is partial. It's likely to lead to a grief experience that feels jarring or traumatic. And it's likely to also be stymied somewhat by the fact that there was less contact with living loved ones. We know full well that strong bonds of support among family are very important to how people grieve and grieve profitably and successfully. So I think looking here at page 21, again, I think we see disruptions in the pandemic at all three stages of the grieving process: prior to death and anticipatory grief, in the immediate aftermath of death, and then later on in formal bereavement. So looking here at page 22 of the handout, well, what can we say in sum then? Well, I think we can say first that the COVID pandemic certainly led to more grief. A large number of deaths will lead to more instances of grief and bereavement, to probably a large number of episodes of grief that were more traumatic than ordinary episodes of grief. Third, many episodes of grief that were probably at odds with bereaved person's expectations. Grief is, for many individuals, a confusing and disorienting experience, particularly in its early stages. And one of the things that certainly helps individuals as they grieve is if they have some idea of what sorts of expectations they can have with respect to the grief process, whether there will be a funeral, whether they will have contact with the person's body, et cetera, et cetera. I like to call this the dearly beloved effect, right? If you know that you're going to be at a funeral where someone utters those words and this is the beginning of a funeral, then you are better situated perhaps to have your emotions cued, if you will, for grieving. And finally, I think we probably saw in the pandemic a lot more grief that's at odds with core traditions and values. Certainly with respect to certain communities that place a high premium on having contact with the deceased, then the pandemic prevented many of them from having grief that abides with or coincides with their own core values and traditions. So the question then is, well, how should we think about this if we're interested in this philosophically or ethically? So I'm looking here at page 23 of the presentation that I've made available to you. Now, grief is a topic that is quite under-theorized in philosophy in general, and particularly under-theorized as a topic in social ethics. But I just want to give a sketch of some arguments that we might give in favor of the idea, first, that we have a right to grieve those whose deaths matter to us, and furthermore, that we have a right to be grieved. That is to say that deceased individuals have, in a certain sense, a claim to be grieved in certain ways. So let me first begin on page 24 here with the right to grieve. So as I understand it, when we talk about a right to grieve, this is most plausibly construed not as a liberty, but as a kind of claim, right? So asserting that one has a right to grieve is not simply that to assert that one cannot be interfered with in a certain way, but rather that one has a certain sort of claim to resources and so forth, opportunities, et cetera, with respect to grief and bereavement. So I suppose the most obvious example of this that many of us are familiar with, in most parts of the world at least, a certain measure of bereavement leave is given to employees upon the death of a close family member or a loved one. And the right to grieve, I think, maps on to two sets of interests that seem to me to be morally substantial. The first set of interests I'll call intrapersonal interests. If you're interested in this, by the way, my forthcoming book that will be out later this year is an exploration of these intrapersonal interests. But essentially what I argue is that the value of grief is that it represents a kind of opportunity for self-knowledge and an opportunity to maintain our relationship with the deceased person despite their having died. As I understand it, grief is a disruption in our relationship with a deceased person. That is to say, their deaths instigate a disruption in our relationship with them. In some sense, what we're doing when we're grieving is we're attempting to put that relationship on a new footing in light of the fact that the person has died. So I think there are interpersonal interests that are certainly served by grieving. In addition, I think there are interpersonal interests that are served by grieving. We know that grieving people provide one another psychological and physical comfort. We also know that it tends to increase a sense of solidarity, that is to say, a sense of acting or working in concert with others. And it tends to contribute to the strengthening of ties among families or within social circles. So I think that these considerations are sufficient to at least suggest that there is a right to grieve, that it serves certain vital interests that we have. Moving forward now to page 25, I also think it's possible to think that there is a right to be grieved. And here too, just as the right to grieve is probably most plausibly construed as a claim rather than a liberty, so too for the right to be grieved. So the right to be grieved, I would suggest, is not merely a right that other people not interfere with your being grieved, but that you have a certain claim on some measure of resources to enable yourself to be grieved and to be grieved in ways that are worthwhile and appropriate. And here again, I think we can point to certain kinds of interests that individuals have in being grieved. For example, most people have or assert pre-mortem claims regarding the disposition of their bodies, how they'd like their bodies to be interred, whether by way of funeral, cremation, use by science, organ donation, and the like. Grieving is also, I think, crucial in terms of the instigation of building one's legacy. A person's funeral, I would say, is the first chapter or the first event by which their legacy is built, that is to say, by which the memories that will constitute their post-mortem identity, so to speak, will be built. And finally, I think we care about being grieved because we will often want our bereaved loved ones to go through this process so that they can be more psychologically whole, that is to say, that they can be healed by their grief process. So I think that these sorts of considerations, both that there is a right to grieve and a right to be grieved, suggest that we are working in the midst of a topic that is in a certain sense a question of justice, right? I think when we look at what has happened during the pandemic, I think a lot of what we are looking at are phenomena wherein individuals have arguably not been given their due, not been treated justly with respect to their own grieving. I think the only analogy, to be honest with you, that seems to me to be apt to the situation that we saw with respect to grief during the pandemic is the experience of grief during large-scale war. So, in the case of deaths in combat, most societies would not view those, most individuals would not view those deaths as good deaths, that is to say, the dying process wasn't good. To die on a battlefield far from one's loved ones and so forth is not most people's idea of a good death. Those who might grieve an individual will have little contact with the corpse in some cases. The interment of the corpse will be delayed or disrupted, or in the case that the combat deaths have, if you will, sort of destroyed the body, then it's precluded altogether because the remains are unavailable. So I'll just say then that there is a significant issue of justice here with respect to grief. People can go ahead and see what I have to say about how I think the medical profession and establishment might respond to this later in the presentation. So I will leave it there.